thank you so much for being here today. Welcome to the Get Your Life Back podcast. Today, I am accompanied by the Healthhacked extraordinaires, who are also brothers, Aaron and Andy. And today, we are going to talk about how you can start the process of demystifying data that you're reading. And so I want to read to you just a little bit from the bio that I have for Andy and Aaron. And before I do that, I just want to say, I'm so glad you're here. This is going to be an awesome interview. So thank you guys for being here today.
Yeah, thank you. Excited to be here.
Well, let me just brag on you a little bit. So Andy and Aaron are brothers, and they started their careers as certified public accountants for a global accounting firm before discovering their passion for health. And after personally experiencing the shortfalls of the current healthcare system and discovering the power of preventative care, Andy and Aaron decided to use their investigative expertise as financial statement auditors to apply those skills to health news. And before we jump into the interview, I want to make sure that if you're able to get on your mobile device or your computer, is to write down their information, because you're going to want to save it for later. You can find them on Instagram at Healthhacked, and that's spelled health. And then hacked is HACKD. And in there, you're going to see a bunch of resources in their bio. And I highly recommend checking out their weekly health newsletter. It's got a ton of great information that you're not going to want to miss. And so without further ado, let's dive into the interview. So thank you again for being here, guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for that introduction as well.
Yeah, the pleasure. We were just talking before we started the recording today about how we met. And I remember seeing your information for the first time on the social media wall of Ryan McGuire of The Pursuit of Happiness.
Yeah, I think he mentioned you, and we connected and really liked the content that you were putting out on mental health and all that. And yeah, I think it makes for a good connection.
It's awesome because I feel like there's this slippery slide between good data and just data that is put out there. And having the opportunity to sort of straddle that integrative line, where I come from Western medicine and I did breast cancer research at Baylor College of Medicine, but then as a naturopathic physician, I've had this opportunity to kind of almost see both ends of the spectrum. And I really admire and respect your approach where you're looking at integrative treatments, you're looking at integrative claims, but you're really putting the accountability bar up higher to make sure that what's being said is actually reflective of reality. And I'm sort of curious, how did you get here?
Yeah, it's interesting. So both Aaron and I kind of had our own path to this whole health and wellness, integrative health journey. Each kind of had our own path that converged at the same time. So I'll kind of give a little bit about how I got there, then Aaron can talk about his side of things. So it started about 4 years ago when my wife was having some vision issues. She it was just starting to get blurry in one eye, and she didn't think much of it, and then it started to get worse to the point where like half her vision was just dark, like black in one eye. She couldn't see out of half her eye. And so that was scary. We went to the eye doctor and he ruled out like detached retina and all this stuff, all the eye stuff on the surface level. So he said, it may be neurological. So that was scary. Got an MRI, and at that point she was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, which is an autoimmune condition. And so that was a really scary time. We weren't sure like how to treat it. What's the best medication? So we cycled through a few different medications, and we wanted to see if there's anything else we could do. Like, could we improve nutrition, exercise, stress? Like, are these things going to help prevent the progression of it? And doctors told us, no, really, your only option is medication. And I have nothing against the medication, but she took the medication and it really caused a lot of fatigue. She just like couldn't do anything. And so I found this this doctor, Dr. Terry Walls, who herself, she has MS herself, and she kind of developed this nutrition protocol, exercise, stress management, all these things to help manage the progression and kind of like rebuild the brain, in a healthy way. And so we started implementing that, and within a month of doing the diet, the exercise, all that stuff, she felt like a new person. Fatigue was gone. She had all this energy back. She said, I feel better now than I did like before I was even diagnosed with MS. And so that just like completely opened my eyes to the power of some of these lifestyle practices, like how life changing they are. And she's been doing that for a couple of years. Have had the past couple of years have had clean MRIs. The MS does not seem to be progressing at this moment. I know that can change at any point, but at that point, I just started doing like a ton of reading, reading books, reading research from legit sources like peer-reviewed journals, things like that, and just trying to educate myself on how nutrition, exercise, mental health, stress management, all those things can like impact how we feel and how long we live. And I want to see other people have that same realization. We've talked about it on our podcast before, but 6 in 10 adults have at least one chronic disease, and 4 in 10 adults have 2 or more chronic diseases. And it's just sad to see some of those people. Like I know I have friends and family that are suffering from chronic illness, and people are living longer, but the quality of life is getting worse. And I hate to see that when there are things that we can do. I know some conditions are not preventable, but there are things that we can do to improve our quality of life. And so that's kind of what led me to this point in my health and wellness journey.
It's kind of like necessity begets evolution, or kind of looking at other options. And so it sounds like, you were empowered with this wisdom and knowledge to a degree, and then at some point it became limiting. And what I think is also profound that you're describing is the experience of a doctor putting a period at the end of the sentence. And I really resonate with this because growing up, I witnessed health issues in my family. And oftentimes the response was, I trust my doctor. And
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important to trust your doctor, and to also make sure that you don't put a period at the end of what your doctor says, because each person may have their own limitations or their own blind spots. And so you begin the process, the journey of looking for more information and looking
Right.
for data. And that's part of what has helped this transformation for her.
Yeah,
And
I know. I think that's great. I think it's all about, and you talk about it, like taking health back into your own hands. Like we do have some, control. We do have, so we're not helpless. That was one thing that we encountered. My wife and I, when we were going through this, we felt helpless. Like we just wanted someone to tell us what to do. And it came to us just, having to do some of our own research, which is frustrating and it's time consuming, but like the payoff was well worth it.
Yeah, I think people really just want like an easy answer now. We're so overwhelmed with information that people are like, okay, what's just the easiest way to get an answer? And for health, it's like go to your doctor and do whatever they say. And more often than not, they will give you a better answer than they're well trained in the profession, but they don't know all the nuances of your own life. Like there's a lot of things in your history, whether that's physical or mental, that you just can't share all of that with your doctor. So it is important to do your own research, especially with now how much access to information we have. Like we have the tools to really discover whatever you need to discover just through using the internet. Now it does take some work. You have to weed out the good information from the bad. That's a challenge on its own. But I think we're at, a time in life where we can get the opinion of a professional, like that's necessary. But in addition to that, pair that with outside information and kind of converge those together. And maybe that's meeting somewhere in the middle on the actions that you actually take.
Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious, Aaron, to hear a little bit about your story. So Andy's going through this journey with his wife, and And then it sounds like what you described in the beginning is you guys kind of converged in creating this amazing enterprise. And so I'm sort of curious if you could share how you got here.
Yeah. So I think it goes back to the early start of our career. Like you mentioned in our bio, we're both certified public accountants. So we studied, accounting in college, and then we went on to work for one of the big 4 accounting firms. And if you don't know much about, I guess, the history of those, you are working, it's a grind. Like working there is a grind, especially your first few years. You get to periods where you're working, 80 to 90 to 100 hours a week. And that takes a toll on you, both physically and mentally. And something I was experiencing kind of through that period and leading up to it was I was having just really bad stomach pains and digestive issues. And I couldn't figure it out. I tried to kind of do my own thing at first. And then I went to a point where I went to a doctor and tried to get some guidance there. And that's a very complex issue to get any type of, gastrointestinal issue solved. I mean, it could be a 1,000 different things. I didn't end up going to a specialist. I stayed just with a primary care doctor. And I went 2 different times and was basically given medication both times to try to solve the issue. And unfortunately for me, that didn't solve it. There was some underlying issue that was still present. And I didn't go on to seeing a specialist. I wanted to kind of still wait it out a little bit. And at this time, I was transitioning actually out of that career of being a CPA or of working at a big 4 accounting firm. So I was there for 2 years. And those 2 years were very hard on me, physically and mentally, like I mentioned. My sleep was very poor. My diet was really bad. I wasn't exercising as much as I had used to. That used to be a big part of all throughout college. I was exercising, and I kind of put that on hold. My personal relationships were not great. My mental health was not great. And all of this was just in a really bad spot. And during this time, I moved on from that job. I decided, I want a more steady job to where it is not affecting my physical health. So after about 3 months of transitioning out of that job, I started doing these things. I started really focusing on the importance of getting 7 to 9 hours of sleep, of eating whole foods, exercising consistently, and really focusing on just on de-stressing and remaining in a good headspace, because that was not at all what I had experienced over the past 2 years. And over the course of that time, the kind of stomach issues just slowly started to fade away, and to a point where I am nearly back to no issues at all. Occasionally I'll have an upset stomach, but for the most part, it's completely gone. And I should mention this before, I did get tested of all types of, I got my blood tested, and I got any type of allergens tested as well. And those came back negative. So it wasn't something I was eating. So it was these lifestyle changes of sleep, of getting rid of stress, of improving my relationships, of working out, doing those things consistently over just 3 months had an impact on my physical health. So I can't pinpoint to exactly what it was. I think it was a mix of all of those things. I don't know what the underlying issue was in the first place either, but that goes to say that lifestyle choices and lifestyle habits do have a really significant impact on your physical and mental health. And just pinpointing the mental health there, those 2 years of working in that job were very, very challenging mentally. So getting out of that, it just completely shifted, shifted and improved the anxiety. And it was just a bad headspace. And it's interesting to see how much that side of the mental health side does impact your physical health as well. So kind of a long-winded story there, but just the end of result was lifestyle changes, like Andy's story as well, can impact your health very significantly.
I think that's a really empowering reminder too for my listeners who feel like they're at the end of their rope, that feel completely helpless, that their doctor's you're going to have to take these medications forever. And if they don't work, then that's it's tough luck.
Mhm.
It's as good as it
Yeah.
gets. And both of you have a similar story where getting information, doing the research, reading the data, and then making changes. And both of you tell the story about changing lifestyle, nutrition, and then you specifically emphasize too, Aaron, the importance of stress and how the stress is impacting the mind-body link, how that the proof is in the pudding. It's what you see. And yet at the same time, there are research articles that come out that say it doesn't matter. And in fact, I remember reading a study about how vitamin E doesn't work. And so it was all over. My dad actually thinks he's a doctorate in Google. So he'll send me these articles. Oh, Nicole,
Right.
why are you trying to get us to take vitamin E? It doesn't work. Look at this. And so then if you read deeper into the research, it's like, okay, so it's a chemical derivative of vitamin E at a subclinical dose for a short amount of time in like an N of 6.
Right.
And
Right.
yet it's being disseminated all over the place, and political agendas are being founded on these research articles. And so this is where Healthhacked can really make a profound impact. And so I'm kind of curious about the conversation that happened between you two and how Healthhacked was born.
Yeah. So I think you had mentioned it in the intro, but Healthhacked is just a weekly newsletter that sort of compiles all the latest research on nutrition, fitness. We have like a mind/mental health section. Sometimes we'll do sleep or other lifestyle things. A lot of people there's so much information out there. Like when you go to Apple News or Google News or just browsing social media, it's so hard to know what to believe and what actually has evidence behind it. And there's a lot of conflicting information. And when people see conflicting information, they kind of freeze. They don't know what to do. Actually, this was just a study that will I think we're including it in our next issue of Health Hack. But basically, if people see conflicting information, they're less likely to take health recommendations moving forward. And so you have all this information out there. People don't know what to believe. And so what we wanted to do, and we recognize this all the time, because like when it started as a podcast and then we made the newsletter, we were seeing all this information, and it took a lot of time to actually like dig down into the evidence. Like you were saying, like sometimes you actually have to dig into the studies and see what even the conclusion that they're making or the conclusion that this article or social media post is making does not agree with like the study, or it's just a poor quality study. So we thought, how can we, but nobody's going to want to do all the research that is required to get to that point. Understandably, a lot of people don't have the energy and time, especially for just a normal person who isn't interested in health. Like it's not a hobby to them. So we thought, how can we take all this information out there, filter out the garbage, and just take like actually high quality research and put it in a way that people will actually read. And like normal people that are browsing and getting most of their information from social media and news outlets, how can we make them want to read this? So basically what we do is we take latest research. Again, it's all from high quality studies, and we kind of boil it down into a couple paragraphs. So people don't have to read the entire study. They don't have to read through an entire article. It's just boiling it down into a way that is short, right to the point. It gives people the takeaways, how they can apply it themselves, and and we try to work in some humor too, so it's entertaining and people want to read it. So, and we weren't seeing that done out there. A lot of like things that you see are just clickbait. So we wanted to filter that out, and we want everything that's in that newsletter to be actually useful and applicable, and most of all supported by evidence.
Yeah,
So
and how we got to the point of the newsletter. Like we started out as just a podcast. So we had a podcast for 2 years, and we still do the podcast weekly. And with the podcast, you can, explain things, talk through them, and really dive into the details and explain, go through a study and explain it in detail without having to do this super high level stuff that we do in the newsletter. And there's plenty of great resources out there with podcasts. We enjoy doing it, so we continue to do ours. But there are fortunately a lot of good resources out there with various podcasts who give great information. With the newsletter, that's what the reason we wanted to kind of break off and also do the newsletter was because we saw when you're, like Andy said, scrolling through the headlines, you do see a lot of clickbaity titles where they aren't necessarily, the content of the article is not necessarily backed by a study, or if it's backed by a study, it's not necessarily a good one. So that's why we decided to add the newsletter on as well, because we want to break into that news cycle and that information that people get out there and try to provide something that people can read quickly, that's entertaining, but also more importantly, backed by high quality studies.
And I love how you've executed that, because the content is something that you can digest really quickly. Like, I finish a meeting, just need to distract my brain, can read it in a minute or less. It is entertaining. I love that you put humor, a little bit of quirkiness into that. And brevity is not always my strong suit, but it is yours, because you are able to distill pretty complex topic into something short so that you can get the data and move on. I'm curious if you could, because you do have this very analytical background, both of you, in your training and finance. I'm curious, what kinds of metrics are you using when deciding, okay, this is a legitimate study, or this part is good, but that part isn't. I'm going to include this in the newsletter, or I'm not. Just kind of curious about your process.
Yeah, that's a good question. So we try to go to, the source. Like, I mean, number one, like, does this come from a peer-reviewed journal? Is this from a reputable source? Who conducted the study? That's where was it published? That's important. You alluded to one of them, like sample size is important. The type of study that was done. So was this just observational? Were we just looking at data correlations, which can be very useful and can point us in the right direction? But a lot of times when you're looking at studies that are just simply looking at correlations, you can draw a wrong conclusion, because correlation does not always equal causation. So if we can, we try to find studies that are trials, randomized controlled trials, so that actually causation can be associated with that. Now, we can't do that every single time, because it's not like the perfect study comes out every single week. But that's one. And then, was it done on humans? Because animal trials don't always translate to human trials. So those are some things that we use. How long was it done? You had mentioned that as well. Was this a two-week trial, or was this done for several months? So that's how we kind of do it. Those are some things that we evaluate. Aaron, did I miss anything?
No, I think that covers the main ones. I mean, one thing to be aware of, and it's hard to always watch out for this, but it's just any type of potential bias within the study. You can look at I don't know if I think all show at the very bottom of the study, like where the funding came from to conduct the study. And, that's not always just because a bias looks apparent there doesn't always mean that bias is within the study. But it is something to take note of. So we do try to watch out for that. Just take a quick glance at who funded the study. And if there is a potential bias, we try to take that into account as we're reading the study. So that takes a little bit more, work to figure that out. But that's a one additional thing that we watch out for when we're reading different studies.
Aaron, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was thinking about Prozac when it was introduced to the market. It took over 20 studies to prove that it was better than placebo. And the manufacturers of Prozac were behind funding the study. And yet they couldn't even, before 20 studies, demonstrate efficacy, and it still got pushed through.
Wow.
And then we have one really crummy study on vitamin E that isn't really following the high scientific method that we would expect on pharmaceuticals. They aren't being applied to some of these integrative methods. And so then they're getting thrown out. And so it's like this larger, not to get too much into politics, but it feels like there is this larger political bias, because if you have more money, you have more freedom to keep doing studies. And Mark Twain says there are lies, there are damned lies, and then there are statistics.
Right.
Having the financial freedom to kind of work towards getting the data that you want. And I feel like that's got to be a really large challenge, because you are approaching the integrative world. And how are you navigating that dance?
Yeah, it really is tough, because a lot of these labs, they're doing the studies, they want to do research, but sometimes like the biggest funding is coming from pharmaceutical companies, and they don't. Not saying there's always like this collusion, but like there is some influence there. Like if this big company, this big organization is going to write you a grant to continue your job, and so you can continue to employ, your workers, like that's, you're going to want to write a more favorable outcome. And not saying that happens all the time, but like it's just something to really be aware of. But it's tough too, because like with studies around like Prozac, those are going to get a ton of funding from pharmaceutical companies, but nutrition studies, really well done nutrition studies are hard, because you have to be really specific about what you're tracking, because there's so many inputs. It's not just like a pill. There's many different ways of eating. And then what's really the benefit to who's the end beneficiary of a study that shows, I don't know, but whatever, vegetables are good for you. I mean, there's not a ton of the beneficiary there is really the patient, the end person. So there's not a ton of money to be made in nutrition research, which is very frustrating.
And it's like the ruler that we're using to measure something's value it's almost like valuing a fish by its ability to climb a tree, so it's like, I give you this pharmaceutical in a double blind study. I created this method for analyzing it, but then maybe nutrition, if I have someone eat an apple a day and they don't get better, and yet somebody else eats an apple a day, they do get better, we can't necessarily use that same rule of measurement to create that same outcome. And so it's like, in some sense, research and doing these studies can be life-changing and opening of therapies for people. But then in another sense, it can almost hold us captive to this idolatry of study.
Yeah. And I think that's where a lot of call it conventional medicine, they can be very effective at treating acute conditions. Like, for instance, you have a broken arm. Well, if you just have a broken arm, like, you need to get that fixed. Like, just eating an apple is not going to just make your arm magically heal. So good at like acute conditions, but very, very bad at managing chronic conditions. And I think that's where preventative medicine comes in, and is really effective at meeting at treating chronic illness. But those things don't get as much funding, which is unfortunate, because I feel like it really could save people so much pain and misery and money.
Yeah, and I feel like just the healthcare system as a whole is it's more focused on being proactive or being reactive rather than proactive. So like, even if you just look at, the types of things insurance covers, like any type of problem that you existingly have, and you go into the doctor, insurance will be like, yeah, we'll cover that. But if you're trying to do something to prevent an illness, so like just take chiropractors or like massage therapy, things that, you're doing these things to help continue your body stay aligned and healthy, and the muscles loosened up, like those types of things are ignored a lot of times. It's just therapy, like a therapy for any type of mental conditions, anxiety, depression. A lot of times it's much harder for insurance to get that covered. And like, those are really important things, and things that you don't see the problems until they happen. And there's so much preventative care that can go on, but people often just don't do it because it is expensive, and you do have to do your own research. And if you don't want to do your own research, you have to go to some type of integrative doctor. And again, a lot of those aren't covered by insurance. So it's the healthcare industry as a whole is, it's much more reactive than proactive, which is unfortunate. And I think there's starting to be a little shift in that with the popularization of integrative medicine. I think we're seeing preventative care be more, the importance of it is becoming more realized. So hopefully that shift continues. But yeah.
And I think you're a part of that shift. I think that the work that you're doing in demanding high integrity research and working on stopping the spiral of clickbait as a primary form of information dissemination, but rather you are seeing a problem and you've identified a solution that has the potential to positively impact a mass group of people. And I really admire and respect that. And so if we kind of do a zoom in, zoom out, and I'm curious about how your lives over the longitudinal trajectory, as you've taken your own personal zigs and your own personal zags, how it has happened that you've kind of ended up on this mission together. And I'm kind of asking kind of like a long winding question as I think about it out loud, but maybe if there's like a moment when you were younger, or a way that your family culture was that you were younger, that sort of helped plant the seed for where
Mm,
you are now.
yeah, that's a good question. One thing that just immediately comes to mind is our watching our grandparents age. My dad's dad had Parkinson's, and that was a long, slow decline physically and mentally that was difficult to watch. Um, and then and until eventually, he died. There wasn't, it was just, how can we slow down the progression? And it was this slow descent. And then his wife, my grandma, she was a diabetic her whole life, and never didn't really manage it well, and didn't have a lot of the support from the preventative area. It was just, take your shot. She was type 2,
Mhm.
type 2 diabetic, and just didn't get a lot of like support or education on how best to manage it. And that was also hard to watch, as she got neuropathy in her feet, and she was just miserable all the time. And it's hard. I think that's when it hits you the most, is when you see somebody you love start to decline and just live in chronic pain. It's tough to see. So I think that planted a seed.
Yeah, I mean, really, all four of our grandparents, they all passed away like when we were really young. Like it was our for me, my early 20s, when all four of our grandparents were gone, and you saw the lifestyle they lived out, in terms of how well they took care of their bodies. It wasn't great, and we saw the impact that had, and it affected us, because we didn't get to have them around, extremely long, and that was difficult. But that has not only impacted us, it's impacted, their son. So our dad has, I think he's seen that as well, and he's made it a huge shift in his lifestyle. So I don't know. I mean, he's always been fairly healthy, but in the past 10 years, he's been very, constantly active. I mean, people like he does CrossFit style workouts, and he's in his he's in his mid 60s, and he is like has a six pack. He's looks more in shape than we are. So it's crazy to see like how much that impacted him as well, and trickles down to impact us. So now we see him, and it's like somebody who's in their mid 60s and has a six pack and is in great shape and eats well. Like that's also inspiring for us to see that, and to want other people, other people in their 60s to be like him, and have those same lifestyle changes.
Yeah, and that's like when we all get together, we work out. Like he's 63 years old, and like we can all still work out together, which is
Mhm.
just, I'm so grateful that, he has made some changes. And he, again, like he kind of had his own journey, I think, seeing his parents go through that. But then with our journey, we've kind of, whenever we got together, we would talk about health stuff. And our whole family is kind of just gradually shifted to this more integrative approach, which has been really, really cool to see. And it's given me optimism. I know when you're out on social media, it can feel like there's no hope left in the world, but like there is a lot of people, and there's a lot of research being done on how we can live not only longer but live better. Like I joke, but I'm kind of serious. Like I think I can live to 120, and I can be in my 90s and be completely active. It's just a matter of kind of making some of those changes today. But it's possible. Like our bodies were built for more than just um, sitting around it and deteriorating. And I think that's coming to light more and more now.
Yeah, I love what you said. We were built for so much more. And
Mhm.
one of my favorite authors, his name is Samuel Hahnemann, and he writes a book called The Organon of Medicine. And in the book, in chapter 9, he calls them aphorisms. But in chapter 9, he talks about the goal of health. And it's really different because in the Western medicine model, health is the absence of disease. But Hahnemann writes that the goal of the physician is to help the body enter such a state of health that it obliges wonderment by those looking, as the body and the mind reaches its loftiest goals of human potential. And oh my gosh, I feel then suddenly the ceiling is opened up for the potential that we have. And it's like what you were saying, Andy, it's like maybe people will scoff 120, but really the definition of health for you is different because you've seen the potential that the mind and the body have when working in alliance and allegiance with them.
Yeah, I love that. No, I think that's so huge. It's seeing our bodies for what they are. They are this amazing thing that has so much potential. And yeah, you talk about like the absence of disease. Like we can thrive. It doesn't just have to be just living. Like we have the opportunity to thrive. There's a book on longevity by David Sinclair called Lifespan, which was great on longevity, on how much potential we actually have as humans in terms of living long and living well. And yeah, I'm more hopeful than ever now about that.
And listeners, this is coming from somebody who's been reading the research, who's been walking the walk, doing the work with family, with his wife. And I think that having that hope, I hope that that's contagious for our listeners. And so as we finish up in this conversation, I feel like I could talk with you guys for hours. And so we'll have to do this again. But I'm kind of curious about how people can filter headlines. So they've listened to this interview, they've listened to this podcast, they've gotten on your newsletter, they're getting things that you've curated and distilled for them. But as I'm scrolling through social media, how can I make sure that I'm filtering headlines properly?
Yeah, that's a really important question because most people, there's a let me pull up the stat here. I think it was the people where they get their news from, and a majority of people get their news from social media. I believe it was 40%, especially those who are younger, much more get their news from social media. I believe it was 45% get it from social media, and only 25% prefer to do their own research. So a majority of people get more news from social media, from news headlines over their own research. That's not a surprising stat. And it's particularly true for the younger generation. So being able to navigate that is extremely important. So whether you read a headline or see a social media post, I think the one thing you should look out for is, is there a scientific study to back this up? If it's a good news article, that will be linked. Not that it's not true. If there's nothing linked at all, you hope there is a link there, but that's kind of the number one criteria to go through. Like, is there something here? Can you validate this claim that they're making in this article or in this post? On Instagram or Twitter, whatever social media you're on, typically people don't cite their sources on there. We try to as much as possible, but for that, you are going to have to go do your own Google research, which takes extra time, and people don't want to do that. But it really is important, especially if you're like resharing health related information on Instagram. You really want to kind of check that. Like, don't take it for what it is. I mean, even us, like, don't reshare our stuff without validating it yourself. So do a quick Google search. If there's nothing linked, no scientific study connected to that, and validate that first. It typically takes just a couple minutes. It's worth the due diligence. So that's kind of criteria one, is make sure this is valid and based on a study. Making sure just like all the information is there, making sure it's a complete set of information. A lot of times you'll see an article or a social media post published that it's true, but sometimes they kind of ignore the other side of the story. They're not telling the full picture. So although what they're saying is based on science, it is true, there's also another side that would be more revealing if they shared it. And oftentimes it's just kind of brushed under the rug to make a stronger point. I guess I have an example of that we saw, and It was like a picture of a steak, and it was just comparing steak and black beans. It was just comparing the two and seeing which one is more nutrient, like has more nutrients in it. And it showed that the steak and the black beans, it showed them having the equal amount of protein. And then it showed that the steak was higher, in sodium, cholesterol, all the historically bad things. And then the black beans were high in fiber. They were high in, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but like calcium, magnesium, things like that. So vitamins that it was high in was listed, but the stats were true. Like what they showed on the comparison was true. Like the nutrients was an accurate representation, but what it left out were two really important nutrients, which was vitamin B12 and zinc, which those are two extremely important nutrients. If you're doing like a plant-based or a vegan diet, those are two that you typically need to supplement because they are challenging to get through just a strict plant-based diet. So a lot of vegans will supplement with B12 and zinc. But those were like left off the list completely because steak has extremely high amounts of both of those. So if you were to add those on, it's like, well, steak really isn't that bad if it has much more nutrients here that you don't get in any plant-based food. So like that's an example of something that you see fairly common, mainly on social media, where this is a true statement, but if you dig a little bit deeper, there's some underlying things that are not shared. So just being sure you're looking out for potential bias, because it does exist in a lot of what's out there, unfortunately, and not taking things just at face value. So those are two things I'd say to watch out for. Andy, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think the last one, and this one's really important, is like, is the information relevant? Like relevant to me? Like all of us are different. Like we're all human, so we all have same types of DNA, but we have different gut microbiomes. We have different medical histories, different metabolism, various abilities to digest certain foods. Like for instance, some people can tolerate gluten just fine, others can't. A lot of people cannot tolerate dairy, but some people can. So just because you see an article, claiming one thing, it may not be true for you. There really is no one size fits all for health. Like each of us are unique, and each of us require a unique solution to whatever it is that we're trying to accomplish. And I think a lot of times that just takes experimenting to see what works for you and what doesn't. Not saying that the evidence doesn't matter, but like when it comes down to it, like there is no one thing that is perfect for everyone. I think everyone's a little bit different. So I think it's important not to be discouraged when you see something on social media and it doesn't work for you. I think in the end, you want information that is relevant to you and helps you progress towards your goal. So to recap that, we do have a little acronym. It's a dumb acronym, but VCR, like validate the claim, make sure it's complete and relevant. So is it valid? Is it complete? Is it relevant? Obviously, you can dig into the studies much more. A lot of people aren't going to do that. I think if you do these things, you can at least filter out like 95% of the garbage.
I think VCR is such a great message to end this conversation on, is validation. So that's V. And then C is, you said, credit?
Completion.
Completion. So validation, completion, and then relevance. Is it relevant for you? Because that's the art of medicine, is individualizing it to your particular needs. So VCR. You guys, it's been such a pleasure. We've been talking with Andy and Aaron of Healthhacked.com. They are the home of a newsletter that demystifies the fire hose to the face of information that's out there on the internet. They distill it into digestible, entertaining, and rigorously evaluated data that you can get access to from the privacy of your phone and your computer. And so find them on Instagram. They have a great bunch of links in the bio with resources and offerings. And definitely check out their weekly health newsletter at healthhacked.com. And thank you so much, Andy and Aaron, for being here. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed this.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole.